today's video, I'm going to talk about for loops in Python. I don't have internet connectivity right now, so I'm going to be running Python from the terminal instead of any sort of IDE. If you don't remember, an IDE is an integrated development environment, one of those displays that has a nice little play button and runs the code for you right there and shows you the errors. I'm not going to do that today. I personally prefer running Python from the terminal. I just find it simpler than installing things, but most people are not of that mind. I am on a Mac, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do in order to run Python from the terminal. So my file, this is a text file, I saved it as forloops.py on the desktop. As a result, I need to make sure I'm on the desktop. So I typed in cd, which is change directory desktop. And now if I want to run this file, obviously there's nothing in it, but when I want to run it, I'll say python3 forloops.py. And if there were any output, it would be printed here. So I am going to code with for loops in here, and then whenever I want to run something, I'll just switch over to the terminal. If you're on a Windows machine, you generally just have to type Python and not Python 3. This is something kind of more specific to Macs that you have to specify Python 3. All of your computers should be running Python 3. It's the more recent version. Okay, two for loops. A for loop has a general structure that I'm going to just write in a comment, and then we'll actually do some examples. So a for loop starts with the word for, and a loop means that some sort of code is repeated over and over for some amount of time. It might be 10 times, it might be until some condition is met. There are different ways to control these loops, but a loop is just repeated code. So a for loop will have this structure. It'll say for, and then usually it'll have some sort of variable. And then we'll have the keyword in, and then we're going to have a thing for the variable to loop through. I will explain this as we do examples, but I want to just get down the general structure. So we're going to say for, and then we'll specify some variable, and that variable is going to maybe go through a list or go through a set of numbers, and the loop will execute until the variable has kind of exhausted itself. We're always going to put a colon at the end of this statement, and then we're going to indent everything that we want to be executed repeatedly over and over. So all code that we want repeated goes here, and it must be indented so that Python knows it's part of the loop. And then if you have any code that's not indented, it's just going to run like normal. So we will see this in action. One thing, this will be pretty standard in Python to have a colon and then statements that are indented. Often this is going to be 4 spaces. However, what you'll see when I'm typing is that my text editor is automatically going to indent once it sees a colon because it's saved as a Python file. And yours might as well. So I would recommend that you just go with whatever your text editor or your development environment does for the indent, because the most important thing with Python is just that all the indents are the same. So if I have the automatic indent and then I try to make an indent later and I use like 5 spaces instead of 4 because mine automatically does 4 spaces on a tab, then it's going to mess up. So just kind of go with the flow with whatever your text editor or development environment is doing. So let's look at an example. For I in range, 10, colon, print I. This is a very small example of a for loop, one of the first examples you'll generally see. So what we have is this format that I've referred to here. We have a variable, and then we have a thing that the variable is going to loop through. Technically, I think this will always be a list, but obviously you see the word range of 10 and you don't think of that as a list, so I called it a thing, a more general thing. So I is going to go through the numbers 0 through 9. So range 10 starts at 0, and then it goes through 10 numbers. And the thing that you have to keep in mind with many computer science things is that we will generally start counting at 0. It's kind of like the lists where we start indexing them at 0. So range 10 is going to make I go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then every time we go through the loop, so it's going to go through the loop 10 times. The first time it goes through, it plugs 0 into here. Then we go into the loop again with I equal 1, and then it plugs 1 into this print statement. Then we go through the loop again with I equals 2. It plugs 2 into the print statement, and so on. If I save this and open the terminal, when I run this, we can see it's giving the output that I described. I is 0 the first time through the loop, so it prints 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. And again, it doesn't print 10 because we go through 10 numbers and we start counting at 0, so it's 1 less than you would normally expect. This range function, if we just give it a number, like some number x, it'll go to x minus 1. If we give it two numbers, like 2 and 10, what this is going to do is it's going to start with I equals 2, and then it'll count up to 9 still. So instead of starting at 0, if we specify the number right here, it's going to start at that number that we specified. And what we can see is it starts at 2. Before it started at 0 when I ran it again, and that's because I have to make sure to save this file to make sure that the changes actually come through. So running it again after saving, we start at 2, as I had said, and we go up to the number 9. So we always go 1 less than the second number in the range function. I can start at any integer value that I want. I could put 0 in here. It would be a little bit pointless because then I'm just typing an extra number when I could have just said range 10. But you can put 0 in here and it'll still start at 0. I can also put a negative number here if I want. So I could put -3. And if I put -3 in this range function, we start at -3, -2, -1, 0, and then again up through 9. And as I said previously, whatever the number is here, we always go 1 less than that. So even if I went -25 to 25, and I ran this, and then I scroll, we can see it starts at -25, it keeps incrementing by 1, and it goes up to 24, so still 1 less than indicated here. The range function can have a third input if we want. If we want to have a third input, we obviously have to make sure the first and second inputs are there, which will specify the starting value, 1 more than the ending value. And then the third value that we can put into the range function is called the step. If I put a step of 2, that means that instead of before where the numbers were incrementing by 1, they're just going to increment by 2. So here if I have 0, 25, and 2, it's going to go 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And we can see we get 0, 2, 4, all the way up to 24. Now, if instead of 25 here, I had 22, then we would normally expect the numbers to go from 0 through 21. However, with the step there of 2, it's going to just go 0 through 20 because the next number would be 22 if we're doing a step of 2. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to go up to 22 because this loop is always going to stop before 22. So it's always going to stop at the highest number that it can that's less than this top number of the range, even if the step doesn't exactly reach that. So here, the step doesn't reach 21, which is 22 minus 1, but it's just going to count by 2 until it gets to the biggest number it can before 22. We can specify the step to be other integer values. I can have it be 3, 0, 3, 6, 9. This one will include 21. I will show you an error first. I guess it's not an error. Here I put a step of -3, and it didn't give me an error. It just didn't do anything because it tried to start at 0 and count by -3 to 22. It just doesn't make sense. So thankfully, instead of giving an error, it just stops and doesn't do anything. So going from 0 to 22 with a step of -3 obviously makes no sense. However, if I went from 22 to 0 with a step of -3, this makes sense because I can count down. So when I have a count up, like 0 through 22, I have to have a positive step, a positive integer step. If I want to count down from 22 down to 0, I can put a negative step. And what this is going to do is it's going to start at 22 and just keep subtracting 3, and it's going to end when it's above 0. If I put a step of -2, we see that it ends at 2 and not 0. As before, this number, the number that was in this position, if we started with 0 and we went up to a number, we always stop one before that number. So if it was 22 here, we stop at 21. Similarly, if we're doing 22 and we're going down to a number like 0, we're always going to stop before the 0 and not include it. So even though 2 minus 2 would give us a 0, this loop isn't going to ever print 0. It's going to stop before that. If I take away the step, then it doesn't do anything. So if you want to have a countdown, even if you want it to count down by 1, you need to specify the step of -1. So 22, 21, this goes all the way down to 1, but again, never goes to 0. So this is the range function that I'm showing you here. And there are these 3 different parameters to play with. The parameters are the inputs. And it takes a little bit of time to get used to. But as you work with these, it will start to make more sense. So before I do other for loops, let's do a couple of examples. So maybe we're going to add all numbers between 0 and 20, including 20, and print the sum. In order to do something like this, I would go 0, and then since I want to include 20, I'll go 21. And I want to add all numbers, so I don't need to bother putting a step in. It's not like I'm adding even numbers or anything. So automatically, this is going to go from 0 to 20. And then I'm going to, every time I go through the loop, I'm going to add whatever the current value of I is to some variable that I call the sum. I have to call this variable the sum because you can see when I just put the word sum in there, it's highlighted in blue, meaning it's a word that has some other meaning in Python, and we don't want to name variables words that are already reserved that have a meaning. Like I wouldn't name a variable range or in or for either, but I is totally fine. So here what will happen is we make a variable called the sum. The sum starts at 0, and then every time we go through the loop, we're going to add the value of I. So we're going to add 0 to it, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, all the way up through and including adding 20. And now I want to print this. And you can see that I'm printing it here without indenting it. The reason that I'm not going to indent this is because I don't want it to print every time that I takes on another value. We don't want it to keep printing throughout the loop. We just want it to add all of the numbers and then print the sum. So since I want the sum to be printed after, I have to make sure that this statement is not indented. So you can see here, I have the number 210 printed, and you could verify that that's the sum of the numbers between 0 and 20, if you desired. Had I not left this here without an indent, so say I indent this statement, print the sum, then every time I go through the loop, it's going to increment the sum and print it. And that's not what we want. We don't want to know all of the in-between calculations. We just want the final number, 210, which is why I unindented this. Now we're going to do a different type of for loop. So in my initial format, I said there's a thing for the variable to loop through. And what we were doing in those last examples was something called the range function. However, I can loop through other things. I can loop through a string. So let's use a different variable. K in banana, print K. This is another for loop that's just printing. Earlier, I used the variable I to go through the loop. Here I used K. This is just to demonstrate that we don't need to use a variable I. Commonly, people will use a variable I when they have a loop. And then if I is already used, they'll often use J. They'll just kind of go through the alphabet, starting at I. But it doesn't have to be called I, J, K. It could even be called I like cheese. We can call it literally anything we want, as long as it is in that area of the syntax for the loop. It is going to take on each value that it's looping through. This is an odd one right here. This is the most, I think, unexpected way that a loop executes. If I have a variable that goes through a string, what's going to happen is first, the variable is going to take on the letter B as its value. Next time through the loop, the variable will have the letter A as its value, then N, then A, then N, then A. So when we loop through a string, we're actually just looping through letter by letter or character by character. Those both mean the same thing, but. So here, if I've printed, each value as I go through the loop, you can see the values are B, A, N, A, and A. So it's going to parse the string out letter by letter. Similarly, we can have a loop that goes through a list. So if I had for J in, and then I had 5, 8, 9, 10, 15, 17, adios, and I printed J. In this case, what's going to happen is that J is first going to be 5, then 8, then 9, 10, 15, 17, and then adios. And let's run this, and we can see again that J is taking on each value from the list one at a time. So I am going to stop this video here. We should do examples of this at some point. These are very useful in programming because often you want to repeat a task and you don't want to type a bunch of the code over and over. And to recap, I just want to remind you that we went through the syntax for the for loop, so how the for loop is structured. We did the for loop going through the range function, which will take a range of values, and we can either just specify one value and it'll just go 0 to that value. We can specify 2 values, a starting and an ending value. And we can specify 3 values, a start, an end, and a step. Or we can go through a string where it'll just go through character by character. Or we can go through a list where the for loop will just go through the list one item at a time. So that is all for how to structure for loops, and again, we will revisit this with examples.